In the early days of the Second World War, it was obvious that Bomber Command's aircraft were woefully inadequate. The single-engined Fairey Battle could only carry a paltry bomb load. The twin-engine Bristol Blenheim and the Handley Page Hampden were too slow and very vulnerable to attack. Only the Vickers Wellington, with a range of 1,500 miles, a payload of 4,500 pounds of bombs and 6 machine guns for defence, was tough enough to survive on daylight raids, where it would meet heavy flak and marauding German fighters. Early losses could not be sustained. In May 1940, daylight raids were abandoned to be replaced by night operations. However, night raids brought their own problems. Crews were not properly trained for night flying, and the lack of suitable navigation aids meant that they seldom hit their targets effectively. In June 1941, the Air Ministry's Butt report concluded that only 1 in 10 aircraft was bombing within 5 miles of their target. In bad weather, that went down to 1 in 15, and with the improvement in German night fighter defences, losses were still mounting. But Bomber Command had to continue the raids. It was the only way that Britain could strike back at Germany and apply some pressure and support of the hard-pressed Russian forces on the Eastern Front. Hopes lay with a new generation of 4-engine heavy bombers and new radar navigation aids. It might be thought strange that the genesis of the RAF's most successful bomber of the war was born out of failure. Avro's original concept was for a twin-engined aircraft designed around the new Rolls-Royce Vulture engine. The Manchester entered service with the RAF at the end of 1940, but it was beset with problems. Unreliable engines, lack of power, and even some airframe defects meant that many of them were lost in crashes rather than on operations. But Roy Chadwick, Avro's chief designer, was convinced that the basic design was sound. He and his team set about reworking the aircraft to accommodate 4 of the tried and trusted Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that were so successfully powering the Spitfires and Hurricanes. The wing was lengthened, and they altered the centre section and tailplane. The first prototype made its maiden flight on January the 9th, 1941, and in subsequent flight trials it performed well above expectations. It was finally named the Lancaster. It had a range of 1,730 miles, a top speed of 275 miles an hour, and at this stage in its development it could carry a phenomenal 12,000 pounds of bombs.
The Lancaster was very, very manoeuvrable. It could be stood on one wingtip and would corkscrew very, very well. It's so manoeuvrable that at least one of the test pilots of Avro would quite often slow roll a Lancaster after he'd put it through a test flight. I don't think you can get a better recommendation for manoeuvrability than that. I know from personal experience also that it was very, very manoeuvrable, although of course I did not try to do slow rolls with bomb loads on.
Within a year, Lancasters were being delivered to their first squadrons, replacing the twin-engine bombers that had struggled for so long. The Lancaster's first operational sortie in March 1942 coincided with the arrival of Sir Arthur Harris as the new Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command. His appointment also heralded a new strategy. From that point on, the task was to destroy the will of the German people by the area bombing of their cities.
In entering the war, then the essential, in my view, is you must make sure that you win the war, and that a war is not generally fought by any Queensberry rules. As far as civilian men and women are concerned, I think it is questionable who is the villain of the piece. Is it the people, the civilians, the men and women that make the bombs, the aircraft, the shells, the bullets, etc., that are the villains, or is it the people that use them?
In the first few months of 1942, ever-increasing numbers of Lancasters became available. By May the 30th, Bomber Command was ready for its boldest strike yet. Cologne was to be pounded by 1,000 aircraft, the biggest raid in history, using virtually every bomber in the RAF. 1,500 tons of bombs were dropped. More damage was done in one night than on all the previous sorties on the city. Despite the new bomber, increasing losses were still of major concern. At the end of 1942, it had been calculated that only 13% of aircrew would survive their tour of duty of 50 sorties, and every Lancaster shot down would cost 7 lives.
All the crew get in by the rear door. The forward members have to climb over 2 main spars with all the flying suits and clothing on to get to the front. A crew of 7, you've got a bomb aimer, a pilot, a navigator, a flight engineer, a wireless operator, a mid-upper gunner and the rear gunner. And I used to fly in the Fraser-Nash 50 mid-upper turret here, which is completely rotating. And because I was right on the top of the aircraft, I was the eyes of the aircraft and was responsible for searching so that we get out of the way the Ju-88s and Messerschmitt 109s. Behind me is the rear gunner and a Fraser-Nash 20 turret with 4 Browning .303 machine guns. The ammunition for the rear gunner is from large tanks inside the fuselage, which are fed in on a sort of electrical servo feed railway line, bringing the belts up to each gun. I think the 303 air-cooled gun was the finest gun used in the last war. Believe it or not, each gun fires 1,150 rounds of ammunition per minute. So the rear gunner with 4 there has got quite a armory in the back. That on top of the fuselage is a large collar round the base of the turret, and if you look underneath the guns, there are 2 arms with 2 little wheels. And when the turret's rotating, those wheels are going round the top of that collar, and if the guns are rotating depressed and still firing, the arms and the wheels is called a taboo mechanism, which lifts the guns up when you're firing and stops you from shooting down your own fins and rudders and the tips of your props.
In 1941, with only 164 night fighters and a crude detection and communication system, Germany had managed to shoot down 422 British aircraft. A year later, the night fighter force had tripled in size and the control systems had been completely reorganized. The cannon-armed interceptors, mainly the Messerschmitt 110 and the Junkers 88C, were now accurately vectored onto targets by ground controllers. Proficient pilots could shoot down up to 6 Lancasters per night by exploiting the aircraft's main weakness, a lack of protection from the underside.
Although you do see pictures of Lancasters with turrets underneath, there are actually gun turrets underneath. There are very few of these really in actual fact. And the fact of the matter was there was no one in the aircraft who could see directly underneath. So the night fighter pilot's favourite mode of attack really was to attack from underneath in a blind spot. And they had 2 methods. One, first of all, if they spotted a bomber, they would dive out of the way so that the gunners couldn't deflect the guns to get at him. It would pull up underneath and give the bomber a squirt from underneath, usually aiming between the engines where they knew the fuel tanks were. And later on, they even fixed upward firing cannon, which they called the Schweiger music, or slanting music. And these consisted of a pair of cannons pointing upward, almost vertically upwards. And all they had to do then really was to find an aircraft, get underneath it, And of course they were flying along at the same speed underneath it, it was almost impossible to miss. And many, many aircraft went down to this sort of attack without knowing actually what happened to them. They would obviously aim for the field tanks, not for the bomb bay, because if the bombs went off, well, it would probably take the fighter with it as well. So they were a bit reluctant to do that. This was the great problem. But of course, that was liable to happen at any time. Really, the gunners, and the usual way we operated as a crew, and I suppose others did, the pilot would take a quarter of the sky from the front out to his wingtip. The engineer would be looking out this side round to the other wingtip, and the two gunners who were at the mid-upper and rear positions would also take a quarter of the sky. So it was rather like a ship, and they would be keeping a damn good lookout. And I think it is a fact that the guns on the Lancaster were not really used very much. The most important job was for the gunners to keep a jolly good lookout and to tell the pilot if they saw anything. But if you saw an enemy aircraft and he didn't think it had seen you, you wouldn't fire at it, you would tell the pilot and he would try to get away, because if you fired your guns it gave your position away and probably you'd have more fighters come down on you. So really firing the guns was a last resort if you thought you were going to be attacked.
It wasn't until July 1943 that an effective solution was found. Bombers dropped bundles of foil strips, known as window, to confuse the German radar.
They created lots of spots and blips on the radar screens, and it made it almost impossible to pick out the aircraft or separate them from the tinsel strips. And this was something which, as soon as you approached the enemy territory, you'd sit on the step down in the nose there, and there was a little chute in the side of the nose, and you could, under these bundles of tinsel would probably be this deep, and we'd push this window out at about 2 bundles a minute for perhaps a couple of hours on end. And when you arrived at the target, the bomb aimer would have come down, so it got a bit congested. He would be in the nose as well, and you used to start up to about 5 bundles a minute with this window.
For the beleaguered men of Bomber Command, any success was a major morale booster. One of the highest profile raids of the war was flown on the 17th of May 1943. 19 Lancasters were specially adapted to carry the revolutionary Barnes-Wallis invention, the bouncing bomb, which was designed to breach German dams. Wallis predicted that these bombs could destroy 3 dams in Germany and that the resultant flooding would cripple German industry in the Ruhr Valley. Flying at ultra-low level, Lancasters of the specially formed 617 Squadron breached the Möhne and Eder dams. Though the results did not show the level of damage that had been hoped for, the raid epitomised the spirit of Britain's resolve, and the versatility of the Lancaster had been proved beyond doubt. The Lancaster's huge bomb bay meant that an assortment of weapons could be carried. One of the most devastating loads was a mixture of 1 8,000-pounder and 6 500-pound general-purpose bombs. And in the spring and summer of 1943, 60,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany's industrial heartland. In July 1943, Bomber Command turned its attention to Hamburg. During one 10-night period, 4 huge raids were mounted using more than 300 Lancasters each time. The result was a firestorm that engulfed huge areas of the city. Buoyed by this success, Harris planned a maximum effort against the great prize, the German capital. Churchill himself approved the plan, and the Battle of Berlin began. Berlin was different from any other Bomber Command target. It was much bigger, and therefore attacks were much more difficult to concentrate. Winter weather and other commitments meant that Harris had to schedule raids over a long period, allowing Berlin time to recover in between. By the spring of 1944, Berlin had not been smashed as Harris had hoped. The spirit of the German people had not wilted, and more than 500 RAF bombers had been lost during the raids.
It often was very, very boring. There were long periods, I'm not saying 8-hour trips, when nothing much was happening at all, but you couldn't really relax because you never knew about the night fighters. They would steal up behind you in the early days and attack from the rear, and if the gunners were awake, you had a good chance of spotting them, especially the rear gunner, and you could probably then take some evasive action. The standard evasive action in 5 group, which was the group to the south of Lincolnshire, was the corkscrew. This was essentially a sudden diving turn and then rolling at the bottom and going in the opposite direction and then climbing again, twisting from one side to the other and repeating the whole process.
We were attacked by a Ju-88 over the sea, and the gunner spotted him, called out for the pilot to go to, I think it was corkscrew to port, and as the wings tilted, he fired at us, and he took about 2 feet off the top of the rudder and a chunk off the end of the wing, and that was the most damage we suffered. Fortunately, the rudder still worked and the aileron still worked, so we were able to come home, and he only made 1 run at us. He obviously thought we'd spotted him and he was not going to chance his arm anymore. But that's a typical kind of attack.
To enable the bombs to be dropped as accurately as possible, it was necessary to fly straight and level. And whilst we were in straight and level position, of course, you were much more vulnerable to fighter attacks. The navigator would indicate that you were X minutes, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes from the actual target, and you would then get on to straight and level, and as you approach target, open the bomb doors so that the bomb aimer could release the bombs, and from then on you just appear a bomb aimer giving instructions to the pilot to make sure that you came up on a correct bombing run until he had the target in his sights and he pressed the bomb release to release the bombs. Being coned in the searchlight, I suppose, was one of the worst things that could happen to you, because you felt as if you were the only person on the raid, that every gun in the area and every fighter was being concentrated on you, and of course it was like daylight in the aircraft, and it was very difficult that if you did take any very evasive manoeuvre as you turned the aircraft onto its side, then of course you got the full blast of searchlight into your face, and therefore you were partially blinded. One of the tricks that I understand that some people employed was that if they were coned in searchlights and they were not managing to get out, if they saw another aircraft above them, then if they flew directly underneath that aircraft, so that at one time the searchlights had 2 aircraft, if they continued their turn, there was a 50-50 chance that the aircraft which remained in the searchlight was the one they'd flown underneath and not themselves.
June the 6th, 1944 marked the beginning of the long-awaited counter-offensive in Western Europe. In support of the ground forces, Bomber Command unleashed a ferocious aerial assault on German troop concentrations, arms dumps and communication links. Because they could be delivered by day, these raids were very accurate. That was possible because the targets were close and fighter escorts were available. Particularly successful was the attack on the E-boat base at Le Havre. Carrying Barnes-Wallis's latest invention, the 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb, the most up-to-date Lancaster 3s of 617 Squadron destroyed the hardened shelters and effectively negated the E-boat menace. Some months later, the success was repeated when the pride of the German Navy was sunk in Tromsø Fjord, Norway. A combined force from numbers 9 and 617 Squadrons found the battleship Tirpitz and scored a direct hit with the Tallboy. But the ultimate in conventional high-explosive bombs came in early 1945. The most potent of Wallis's inventions was the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb. It was too big even for the Lancaster's capacious bomb bay, so it was slung underneath the fuselage and dropped by an electrical release mechanism. When the bomb hit, it would penetrate 30 feet into the earth before it exploded. And a massive crater would be formed. Anything above would fall into the hole.
And here is the result. Although not a direct hit, many yards of the viaduct have been destroyed. The Nazi world is in ruins.
But the vast majority of Lancasters were continuing with the area bombing of German cities. On February the 13th, 1945, one of the most controversial raids of the war took place. The beautiful city of Dresden appeared to hold no strategic significance except as a junction for German troops, either travelling to the Western Front or retreating from the east. But it was on the list of targets, and 769 Lancasters pounded it, dropping more than 2,500 tons of bombs. Tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives, and much of the city was devastated by a firestorm. And the German night fighters were in such a shattered state by this point that only 6 Lancasters were shot down. Just 11 weeks after the Dresden raid, Germany surrendered. Discussion over the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign will continue for many years to come. But of one thing, there is no doubt. The systematic destruction of Germany's industrial heartland forced the dispersal of arms manufacture. When the arms were moved, they were severely hampered by the destruction of road and rail links. Compounding the chaos, an offensive against Hitler's synthetic oil plants caused the Luftwaffe literally to run out of fuel. In the forefront of the tens of thousands of sorties flown against Germany was always the Lancaster. The 59 squadrons of Lancasters dropped more than 600,000 tons of high explosives and a staggering 51 million incendiaries. These versatile aircraft, carrying a wide variety of bomb loads and flown by the exceptionally brave men of Bomber Command, plied their routes night after night to the flak and fighter-filled skies of Germany, delivering the Allied message of impending victory. But the Lancaster's wartime swan song was not a bombing. Instead, Operation Manna dropped stores and food to the starving citizens of Holland.
Holland was starving. There were no cats left to kill. Even the dustbins were empty. In a few days, Bomber Command dropped over 2,000 tons of food, and the immediate crisis was past.
When I fly around these days, especially in Lincolnshire, it strikes me that not all that many things have changed since the aircraft flew around in the war. And obviously, when we fly around, we're the only Lanc there, but you're trying to think of the idea of, with all the airfields around this area in Lincolnshire, all the other Lancs flying around as well, and the fact that you must nearly always be able to see some other Lancs somewhere in the sky. It's one thing we don't do, but of course on the ground, many of the ground features are just the same. Some of the old airfields are still there, you still see them, and often we fly past Lincoln Cathedral, which is one of the landmarks, which was obviously very poignant for guys in the war. And the coastline hasn't changed much, the wash is still the same, much the same. And people often ask me if it does feel the same as if flying in the war, and of course, to me, the situation is very different. I've got no fear of being shot at, I've got no fear of the weather because we never fly in bad conditions. And the only sort of slight nagging doubt in the back of my mind is trying to carry off a presentable landing at the arrival point.
The Lancaster, in my view, was the best of the 4-engine aircraft. It was a bomber designed to do a specific job, which it did extremely well, and helped in no small measure in the ultimate victory of the Allies.